writing is a process. Almost nothing we can do, almost nothing that we do will come out perfect the first time that we try it. Writing is definitely no different. Writing is a very complicated thing. We have to have focus, we have to have structure, and we have to have development. So as we're developing our ideas, it takes a process. We have to have, a time to develop. We have to have a time to focus, and we have to have a time for structure in our process. The process is overlapping sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily always go in exactly the same order that I'm about to tell you about. And sometimes when you get to the fifth stage of the process, you have to return back to the second or third stage, maybe even the first stage, and start all over again. Just depends. But in any case, things that you take pride in take time. So make sure you're comfortable with making sure that every essay that you write for this class and other classes, it's the result of at least 2 or 3 drafts. Alright, so the process starts with stage 1 is understanding the task. Stage 2, gathering your data. Stage 3, invention. 4, drafting. 5, revision. And 6, editing. So that sounds like very vague, I'm sure, right? So we're going to go into a little bit of detail about each stage. The first stage is understanding the task. Well, in academic writing, at least in school, you're going to have a task that your instructor provides you. The instructor is going to have some expectations, and therefore you're going to have sort of a list of criteria you need to cover in your writing. So make sure you understand all the parts of the task that your instructor is asking. Because if you only do half of them, that means you're only covering 50% of what your instructor wants. Even if you write the page minimum that your instructor asks for, if you don't include half of the information your instructor wants, or half of the analysis that your instructor wants, or whatever it is, half of whatever it is, then you really only deserve an F. I hate to say it. It's a scary letter sometimes. But we don't want the F's, we want the A's. So we've got to make sure we understand the entire task. So highlight the most essential parts of it. Take notes in the margins. Make sure it's printed out so that you can do these things. Take notes. Clarify things that so that when you look at the writing task, you understand them. So you want to take notes for clarification and so forth. All right. Stage 2. Gathering data. That is, you want to gather the information, the facts, the statistics, the examples, personal examples from your own life or from others or from the news, from the real world, wherever all of these pieces of information come from, you need to gather them so that you have plenty to work with when you start writing, when you start drafting your essay. And before you even start drafting, you're going to have another stage. Stage 3 is invention. So once you've gathered your information, you've got to find, all right, well, what do I want to do with it? Make some connections and go in different directions. You've got some facts and stuff, but what do these facts mean? So do things like create a web, do a free write, list. You've probably already listed in the data gathering stage, but maybe you want to reorganize your list, extend upon those things in that list. All right, so it's kind of part of the data gathering section, but you probably in the invention stage you're going into more depth than you had gone into with the data gathering stage. before you finish with the invention stage, whether you're webbing or free writing, I challenge you to do an outline. That way, when you get to the drafting section, you have some idea of the structure already. All right, so you've gathered your information, you've done some free writing, you've done some webbing or whatnot. Try to determine the outline. What are the big ideas that you want to talk about, and what are the connections between those big ideas that give you a thesis statement, hopefully, or a working thesis statement. All right, well, some time between the invention stage and the next stage, you're going to do an outline. And then, so what I suggest is you're going to need to have a working thesis for stage, what is this, 4? Stage 4, drafting. You got to start with a working thesis. You got to have an idea of where you're going with this before you start writing this essay with no direction, right? So if you've outlined your big ideas, made the connections, come up with a working thesis. A working thesis is just a way to say your thesis may change, and probably will. You're going to develop your information and develop your big ideas that support your thesis, and so as you do that, you're going to refine your thesis and narrow your thesis from a broader statement down to something more specific. Your thesis does need to be clear in the end, at least by the time you're done with your final draft. In the beginning, it might not be so clear, and these other things I'm about to say. Your thesis needs to be clear. It needs to be arguable, debatable, right? It needs to respond to the entire prompt, all of the aspects of what your instructor is asking. And it needs to be not too broad, but it needs to be specific enough. Not too specific in terms of it can't be a fact or something that's not arguable, that's really specific and straightforward. It has to be arguable, but it has to be specific enough that it's not too broad, in which case you would need to write a 20-page paper instead of whatever the size of your paper is expected to be. As you're developing your thesis, you probably want to think about these questions. And you want to do this throughout the entire essay process. But who is involved? What are the aspects involved? When did it happen? Or when is it happening? Is it current? Did it happen in the past? Is it relevant to the past and the current and the future? Is it, or when did it happen, and where and how did it happen? These might not be applicable to all thesis statements in all situations of writing tasks, but you want to make sure you're thorough in thinking about all of the aspects of the topic. As you are drafting this 4th stage, you might start with a question. What is it that you really want to prove, or what do you want to understand by the end of this? And if we're talking about a research paper, that's more obvious that you might start with a research question, something that you ultimately want to find out about your topic. If it's a smaller paper, doesn't require a lot of research, you still might want to start with a question in the drafting stage. But let me tell you this, in the essays that you write for me, I do not want any questions in your final draft. I know it is one method of starting an essay, but generally what I've found with almost all of the questions that start essays from my students, and maybe it's a fault of my own, but I found that they're too simple, or they're just using questions because they don't know another way to start an essay. So I'm going to say in the drafting stage, you can start with a question. But by the time you get through writing your essay and developing it and focusing and structuring it and revising it and editing it, you need to edit out that question into the answer to that question. Turn that question into a thesis statement, or a statement if it doesn't turn out to be the thesis statement. Sometimes it won't be necessarily in the introduction paragraph. It might end up getting moved, but don't leave it in question form. make sure you answer the question if it's relevant still to your thesis by the end of the writing process. Okay. But sometimes it helps us find a direction if we ask the question in the beginning of the writing process. Just don't leave it. If I haven't made that clear, do not leave your question in your essay by the time you get to the end of the writing process and you're publishing it. All right. In other words, you're submitting it, turning it in without a question. I feel like I said that a million times. So take it seriously. No questions. The answer to your question should be an assertion about your topic. Okay. Also in the drafting portion of your, when you're writing in this process, some people want to always start with an introduction. While you're drafting, no. You can certainly start with a thesis, and you should while you're drafting your essay, but save the introduction and the conclusion. That is, save writing your introduction and writing your conclusion until you've drafted the body of your essay. The meat of your essay is in the body anyway. Sure, the thesis statement should be in your introduction, and that should be the most important sentence of your essay because that's the focus. But you can just leave that thesis statement as your introduction as you develop your body paragraphs. Okay. But that being said, eventually you do have to draft your introduction and your conclusion. So one of the things that you could do in the introduction is start with a quotation. You could use well-phrased remarks to set the context and to hook your reader, right? Be careful not to let the quoted material overshadow your voice, however. Quote only what you need to make your point clear with. Okay. You could start, instead of quotation, with a historical review of a controversial issue or whatever the issue is. Some readers will be unprepared to follow the issue you discuss without some background information. So, in the introduction, it's a great place to put background information. And you would put that before your thesis statement. You want to give readers enough information to get started. But don't allow your background to be excessive so that it is a distraction from what you're doing. You just want to give enough background and the essential background of the history of your topic. All right, and some people might start with the thesis statement. I'm going to, however, steer you away from making your first sentence your thesis statement. By the time you get to your final draft, you should make that thesis statement finish your introduction, not start your introduction. Okay? All right. You also would need to draft a conclusion. Once you've drafted your body and your introduction, draft your conclusion. What this is, your conclusion, you can think of it as kind of a bridge between the meat of your essay, the body of your essay, and your reader. A bridge between the essay and the real world, or the reader within the real world. It sort of makes it relevant. The conclusion should be, I'm sorry, in the body you may have already made it relevant, and you should, but the conclusion should make sure it's clear that this topic is relevant to your reader and to the world at large. If your topic isn't relevant to the world or to people in the world now currently, then at least in this class, there's not any reason to focus on the topic. Pick a topic that is relevant. All right. So within your conclusion, you want to you do want to restate your thesis. You want to summarize your main points and connect your assertion to the world outside the essay. It's not just important in your essay, it is important for all of us. We're all connected, and even if it's hard to see the connection, for you yourself with the people that are reading it. You should at least make the connection to people that are living, and that should be good. I mean, current importance should be in this conclusion. All right. As you're discussing the significance, you might state the subjects, maybe a call for further research or a call to action. You might provide a solution or make recommendations. You might relate with an anecdote. If you started with an anecdote in your introduction, for example, you want to return to that anecdote and complete it and show how it's relevant. You might quote a famous person or an expert on your topic. Make sure you embed the quote. You might want to speculate on what might happen in the future. If you started your essay with a historical review with background information, then you want to make sure that you state the significance of where this has gone beyond that history and how it's important now. Okay, so that's it about the drafting stage. So once you've drafted your essay, you should set it aside, if at all possible. If you have the time, start early enough so you finish your first draft early enough. Set it aside for a couple of days if you can, so that when you look at it again, you're sort of looking at it from a new, it's almost as if you haven't read it recently, at least. So, because when you read something that you just wrote, it's often hard to read what it really says. We want to sort of read what we meant to say. And if we were just writing about it, we know what we meant to say. And so when we read it, sometimes we overlook what it actually says. In other words, if there are errors in the logic, we don't see those as easily if we look at it right away after we finish it. Before we start revising, we want to give it a little, take a step back, give it a little space. All right, so in your revision, fifth stage, I think. In your revision, you want to look at the large-scale problems. Deal with the structure. So, deal with the structure and the content and the development. So, let's see. What would you do? You could look at the structure by making sure you check to see if it does still follow the outline. So you want to outline your sections of your paper. Each section should have a main idea that supports your thesis statement. So in the margins, print out your paper, and in the margins, identify each section. Write a summary of each section in the margin. And that's probably going to be the same as or similar to the topic sentence of each section. If you have difficult identifying the main point of any section, you probably want to rewrite that section. And you want to make sure that it is relevant and essential for your main idea, your thesis statement. Sometimes we might have one of the problems with identifying the main idea of a section is maybe there's too many ideas in that paragraph, too many big ideas. So you need to make sure each paragraph or section is focused on one big idea. All right, so you might need to rewrite it for that reason. Sometimes you might need to rewrite it in order to make it clearer so that it's understandable. So determine each point in the margin. Make sure each of those points of each section relates to the thesis. And if they don't, you're probably going to want to ditch the ones that don't, or rewrite them sometimes. But you want to scrap the ones that are not relevant for your main idea. And sometimes that's easier said than done. But remember, writing is a process. It's not easy, and so you've got to struggle. Thinking is difficult, and writing is thinking. Writing is difficult. You want to make sure that the points you made are not simply restating your thesis also. Sure, you want to refer back to your thesis in ways, but you don't want to simply restate your thesis throughout your essay. So make sure you're not just doing that every time you start a new paragraph or a new section, for example. You want a topic that helps prove your thesis, a subtopic of your thesis, but you don't want to just restate your thesis because you don't know how to start a new section. Find this, make sure you have subtopics. You want to make sure the structure, right, we're talking about structure, you want to make sure each of these subtopics is in logical order. Each of the sections of your paper is in a logical flow and order. Okay? All right, next stage, the final stage is editing. So now that you've done you've got a focused paper, it's focused on your thesis, and you've got structure with subpoints of your thesis, and you've got development. Before I talk about editing, let me make sure I emphasize, when you write the body of your paper, make sure every section, every section has development. And what I mean by that is it has those subpoints are supported with evidence, and evidence that go into some depth, and the depth of those pieces of evidence are explained and analyzed and interpreted. You want to go into depth, not just provide the evidence, but explain the evidence as much as needed. Sometimes you don't need to explain certain pieces of evidence as much as others. But don't assume that your reader, you want to think of your reader, for most of these essays, your reader is a general audience who isn't necessarily all that knowledgeable about what your subject is. So you need to explain those pieces of evidence. And that's where one of the places that students have trouble. They come to me and they tell me, oh, I can't write a 5-page essay on this topic. Well, then I look at their essays and I find that they don't have very much evidence. So I'm saying, okay, well, you've got to add evidence. So they add evidence. And I'm simplifying this, but then they give it back to me and they're still short. It's still not a 5-page paper. And so I look at it and I said, well, you haven't explained your evidence. So then they explain their evidence and they give it back to me and it's still short. Well, they need to go into more depth with their explanation. How is this evidence, not only how do you explain it, but how is it important for today's world? How does it relate to them? How does it relate to people around them? How does it relate to anyone else in the world? So development of these body paragraphs and these sections of the body of the essay, developing them is very important, and that's why I can ask of you an 8 to 10 page paper by the time we get to our research paper. 8 to 10 pages, honestly, is not that much. So anyway, let's move on. That is if this class that you're watching this video for has a research paper. So I guess this might be used for more than one class. But all right, so editing. All right, so now you want to edit your paper. You want to look at basically the sentences and the transitions between sections of your paper, and you want to edit it for style and for correctness. And okay, so one of the things that students also have a problem with and need to improve on and use this in their editing. Excuse me, I'm going to get up while I'm going to turn the lights on. They just turned out on me. All right, I am back. So one of the things that students need to do is make sure that the ideas are clear when they change from one idea to another. When you move from one section of the paper to another, one stage to another, when you move from one time to another, one place to another, one topic or subtopic to another subtopic, you need to transition. And so hopefully we have another video on transitions. Certainly you can do some research on that. But basically you are letting it be known to the reader that you are moving from one thing to another. So if that means you're moving from morning to evening, then in the beginning you might say, or at one point you might say, early in the day such and such happened. And then when you're moving to the evening, you say, after a great deal of time in the evening now, something like that. You need to make it known that you're moving from one time to another, one place to another, one topic to another, whatever it is. So transitions are not just transitional words, like in first, second, third. Those are just single words. Sometimes it's a full sentence that moves the reader from one idea to another. So make sure you understand we're not just talking about that list of transitional words that one teacher or another may have given you. Those are often words for a certain purpose, but they don't cover all of the types of transitions. So a transition for us is moving from one idea to another, transitioning from one idea to another clearly, so that the reader doesn't get lost or held back and wondering how we got from one place or from one idea to the next. You have to make sure it's clear that you're moving. So not only in the editing process do you need to make sure your transitions are there, but also you want to check for varying lengths of sentences and varying types of sentences. So some of your sentences should be short. Some of your sentences should be long. Short sentences are often used for emphasis, to emphasize a point after you've used a series of long, convoluted sentences. Okay, longer sentences are often used to add complexity and maybe necessary detail that a short sentence can't allow for. You want to make sure that some of your sentences are compound, some are complex, some are compound complex. Some of the compound sentences are structured with coordinating conjunctions between the two independent clauses. Some of your compound sentences are structured with adverbial conjunctions, that is conjunctive adverbs, separated. You should know this from your last English class or from one of your English classes. But you know how you separate two independent clauses with a period. You can have two separate sentences, putting a period between them. And sometimes you can instead put a semicolon between them. But sometimes when you put that semicolon, you use a conjunctive adverb after it to introduce the next clause. It's like a conjunction, but it's anyway. Long story short, you want different sentence types, different ways of saying them, and different lengths throughout your paper so that it stays lively. You want a lively style, keep your reader interested. You don't want a series of short, choppy sentences. You want to have all types. Let me move on now before I start repeating myself again. All right, you want to also concentrate on the correctness, so make sure your grammar is correct so that you're actually saying what you're trying to say. Sometimes people don't understand why I mark them down so hard when it comes to a grammar mistake or several grammar mistakes. They don't realize that when one has poor grammar, their meaning is very wrong. I mean, it doesn't mean what they want it to mean if their grammar is incorrect. So make sure your grammar is correct so that what you're actually trying to say is what you're saying. For instance, let me say this again. What you want to do is you want to check your previous papers for a type of grammar mistake that you made in the past, that you maybe make a lot often in the past, have made a lot in the past. So let's say you have comma splices or something like that, and so you want to make sure you study up on comma splices, and then make sure you don't have any comma splices in the paper. Or if you have you're commonly misusing a word, let's say it's one of the there, or theirs, or to, or two, right? You don't want to be using the wrong to, because if you use the wrong word, it doesn't say what you mean it to say. And maybe I'm a little picky about that, but I expect you to be as clear as possible. And so, let's see. And after you complete your final edits in this last stage, if you have time, hopefully you've made time to set it aside for a day or two before you have to submit it to your class. Give it a day or two and reread it and check again for any errors, whether they're for revision errors or for editing errors, the corrections that you need to make, so that you can make a third or fourth draft and make it even better, and hopefully get the best grade that you expect. Because a lot of times people expect A's. They've had a lot of easy classes. This one's not an easy class, I can guarantee you. I have high expectations of you, high standards, and if I didn't, you would get through this class to the next level and not be prepared, or as prepared as you should be. So, all right, well, that should be it for this video, and I hope you all have a great day. Happy studying, happy writing. Take care.